On July 7, 1535, Sir Thomas More was escorted from his cell in the Tower of London. Armed guards led him to a nearby scaffold. Twice, his daughter broke through the guards to ask him to bless her. Sir Thomas did, and he pardoned his executioner, as was the custom.
I am the king's good servant, and God's first.
The axe fell, and Sir Thomas More died for putting God above his king. The death of Sir Thomas More was a deep shock to the writers of Europe. To them, More was a hero, a leading scholar of the European Renaissance. The Renaissance was a period of incredible creativity that spanned more than 200 years, a cultural flowering that took root in Italy and spread through all of Europe. During the Renaissance, Europe rediscovered its Greek and Roman heritage. Man is the measure of all things, said the Greek philosopher Plato. Ideas about the worth and potential of every human being, expressed 1,000 years before, affected people in the 1400s deeply. This reclaimed value became known as humanism.
What a piece of work is man! How noble in reason! How infinite in faculty! In form, in moving, how express and admirable! In action, how like an angel! In apprehension, how like a god! The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals.
Writers, artists, and scientists now began to emphasize truth and accuracy as they took measure of the real world and the heavens around them. Sponsored by such banker princes as the de' Medici family of Florence, arts flourished, fed by the talents of Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo, and others. Society was changing quickly, and writers had more power than ever before to spread ideas that made change happen. They began to question every aspect of human existence, including existence itself.
Fulk Greville was a brilliant English poet who wrote in the late 1500s. In the 6-line poem I'm going to read to you, he addresses those who find out what life is, or try to find out what life is, by considering death, which for a Christian like Greville is a way of interrogating or talking to himself. I think he packs an amazing amount into the 6 lines of this poem. And the moment when he addresses the reader always gives me something of a chill. You that seek what life is in death, now find it air that once was breath. New names unknown, old names gone, till time ends bodies, but souls none. Reader, then make time while you be but steps to your eternity.
Sir Thomas More and the Dutch scholar-priest Desiderius Erasmus were among the most famous Renaissance writers. Their outspoken criticism of the Catholic Church would soon kindle widespread revolt, a conflict called the Reformation that would split Western Europe into Catholic and Protestant nations. During the Renaissance, expanded trade in the East brought great wealth to Italy. It also brought knowledge. Chinese, Indian, and Muslim mathematicians and scientists were more advanced than those of Europe. They were adept in algebra, chemistry, astronomy, and medicine, and some had preserved the classical studies of Greece and Rome. This new learning spread from Italian cities to the cities of Northern Europe. Scholars studied physics and examined the human body. Scientific advances, especially in navigation and weaponry, fostered even more expansion and trade. International networks of banking and credit emerged, and the seeds of a new economy were planted. On May 29, 1453, Muslim armies led by the Ottoman Sultan Muhammad II captured the city of Constantinople and ended the Byzantine Empire. Many Byzantine leaders fled north to Russia, which became the new center of power for the Greek Orthodox faith. Other exiled Byzantine scholars settled in Italy, where they taught the Greek language and helped rekindle interest in classical Greece. Cut off from their eastern trade routes, Italian merchants turned west and south. Some merchants and ship captains of Italy sailed for Portugal, down the west coast of Africa. Prince Henry the Navigator reached the Cape Verde Islands in 1456. From this base, they competed with the Arabs for the West African trade in gold and slaves. The kings of Portugal and Spain rewarded their ship captains with land, just as their predecessors had rewarded their loyal knights. On the Cape Verde sugar plantations, these new landlords used slave labor, which they still regarded as feudal serfdom. But the way this slave trade was financed showed a new economy, replacing feudalism. In the Middle Ages, feudal armies had been formed by temporary alliances of knights, who fought in return for land and favor from their king. But in the 1450s, monarchs were hiring their own armies and navies, who received pay and orders directly from their kings. With the appearance of the first rifles, royal armies had even greater advantages. To arm and supply their troops, rulers turned to the wealthy merchants who controlled the cities. In return, the cities' leaders received royal charters, granting them trading privileges and a voice in government. The exploration of Africa, India, and America, as well as the national wars of the 1500s, were all paid for by this alliance of monarchs and merchants. The new economic system came to be called mercantilism. The 1450s also marked the birth of modern communications. During the early 1450s, Johannes Gutenberg and other German bookmakers began printing with movable type, carved letters that were set in racks. To make a new page, the typesetter only had to rearrange the letters. The magnificent Gutenberg Bible appeared in 1456.
Once you had type set into the press, you could make as many copies as you wanted or as you needed. But you would always have to be careful not to make too many, because you had to make as many as you knew you could sell. And you have to spend money on paper and ink and labor to make those impressions from the press. And until you knew for sure that you could sell them, that you would only print as many as you needed. Particularly in the early years of printing, they didn't go overboard printing large amounts of material because they had a fairly limited reading audience.
Gutenberg's triumphs gave Europe a new and very profitable industry. Printing transformed everyday life, and early printers became missionaries for their new technology.
Those who cultivate letters must be supplied with the books necessary for their purpose, and until this supply is secured, I shall not rest.
More and Erasmus belonged to the first generation of college students to be educated with printed books. Like their counterparts in Italy, More and Erasmus and other northern scholars enthusiastically took up humanism and used printing to circulate their opinions. Their combination of humanism and theology became a trademark of the Renaissance in Northern Europe. A printing press in the cellars of the Sorbonne, then a theology college in Paris, France, began to print French editions of classical and humanist texts. The French Renaissance writer Michel de Montaigne pioneered a new literary style, the essay, a short literary composition that explored one main idea.
A wise man never loses anything, if he have himself.
Spain, too, felt the influence of the Renaissance, with advances in the fields of historical and biblical scholarship. Cardinal Jiménez de Cisneros founded the University of Alcalá de Henares and published a beautiful Bible in which the text was printed in Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. But it was in Italy, above all places, that the Renaissance flourished. The court of Leonello de Estes at Ferrara became a center of Italian poetry and drama. The beautiful epic poem Orlando Furioso was written there by Ludovico Ariosto.
Of loves and ladies, knights and arms I sing, of courtesies and many a daring feat, and from those ancient days my story bring, when Moors from Africa passed in hostile fleet, and ravaged France with Agramant their king, flushed with his youthful rage and furious heat, who on King Charles the Roman Emperor's head had vowed due vengeance for Troiano dead.
One of the most influential books of the Renaissance, The Prince, was published in 1513. In it, the Italian writer Niccolò Machiavelli dropped all pretense of piety and described the actual power plays of rulers.
A prince should have no other object or thought, nor acquire skill in anything except war, its organization and its discipline. The first way to lose your state is to neglect the art of war.
To counter Machiavelli's arguments, Erasmus, by then a priest, published The Education of a Christian Prince in 1516. But serious books were only a small part of the booming market for print. Literacy was spreading through the general population, especially among merchants and those who worked in the printing trades. For these readers, shorter pamphlets were much more affordable than books. By 1500, thousands of titles were in print. Most people in Europe, including humanists like More and Erasmus, were devout Christians, and religious literature topped the preferred reading lists. Lives of the Saints, editions of the Psalms, books of sermons and devotions. The best-selling titles on the New Science were those on military technology. Sensational murders, miracles, and mystical subjects such as alchemy, astrology, and witchcraft also sold well. Romances of chivalry were wildly popular. In 1485, for example, the English printing pioneer Thomas Caxton printed La Mort d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur, by Thomas Mallory, a modern retelling of the legends of the Round Table. Advice on manners also sold well. These books appealed to civil servants, lawyers, merchants, people who depended on favors from the expanding royal bureaucracies. The Courtier, by Baldassare Castiglione, was published in Italy in 1528 and soon translated into other languages. During the 1500s, more writers than ever were courtiers themselves, composing sonnets, plays, and songs for the increasingly lavish royal courts. But thanks to printing, poems composed for monarchs quickly became street ballads.
My true love has my heart, and I have his. By just exchange, one for the other given. I hold his dear, and mine he cannot miss. There never was a better bargain driven.
Discontent with the church continued to spread through all classes of European society. Nobles and rulers resented the church because it owned many of the richest lands and cities. To make matters worse, church leaders usually refused to pay taxes toward local defense while demanding their own fees from the citizenry. Erasmus corresponded with many of his fellow humanist writers deploring the immense wealth and corruption of the church. In 1516, he published an edition of the New Testament in Greek, making it and its belief in the redeemability of humanity available to people for the first time in its original text. Like Erasmus, Sir Thomas More demonstrated the spirit of reform in his writings. In his book Utopia, he describes an idealized world where everyone is provided liberty of conscience.
It should be lawful for every man to follow the religion of his choice.
On October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther, a monk and professor at the University of Wittenberg, Germany, nailed a document of protest to the door of the Castle Church. Luther's 95 Theses listed his complaints against church corruption and misuse of power. The Protestant Reformation would have occurred without Martin Luther, but he fanned the fire that turned general discontent into an explosion. The immediate cause of Luther's anger was the church's sale of indulgences, special favors with God, sold in order to raise money for wars against the Turks. Many people besides Luther opposed this practice. After Luther's protest, German nobles used his ideas as legal grounds for seizing church lands. All of Europe were drawn into the controversy. Erasmus, More, and other Christian humanists wrote to Luther. They sympathized with his opinions but urged him to make peace with the Pope. Luther grew even more militant.
If we strike thieves with the gallows, robbers with the sword, heretics with fire, why do we not much more attack in arms these masters of perdition, these cardinals, these popes, and wash our hands in their blood?
In a sense, there were two wars during the Reformation. There was the actual battles. There were the actual battles between Protestant and Catholic forces that swept through Europe in the 16th century and into the 17th, well into the 17th. But there was also something we often refer to as pamphlet wars, which is the use of print to get across your point, to use propaganda.
For all its horrors, the Reformation accomplished many positive social changes. The wars ended the feudal system once and for all, as well as the church's control over literature, science, law, and education. The Protestant writers who followed Luther gave the new faith firmer foundations in logic and theology. The Reformers also made the Bible available in many common languages so that people could judge matters of Christian faith for themselves. Martin Luther's greatest legacy, in fact, was his New Testament in German.
You have the beginning with Luther's use of print to get his message across, and then into Calvin, and you have layers and layers of theology and sort of political structure built into this system of Protestantism. And so Protestantism was really based on the printed word in some ways.
Meanwhile, the Catholic Church made some reforms from within, but also staged its dread Inquisition. The Reformation failed to truly separate church and state. Instead, national churches were established. Nations were Catholic or Protestant, depending on the religion of the ruler. In 1593, France was reunited under the Catholic faith. Charles V of Spain, the Catholic grandson of Isabella and Ferdinand, inherited all the Habsburg lands plus Spain and its American colonies, and went down in history as Charles the Great. Under Charles and his successors, Habsburg Spain enjoyed a siglo de oro, a golden age of literary excellence. Spanish theater produced great playwrights, such as Lope de Vega, Tirso de Molina, and Pedro Calderón de la Barca. Tirso de Molina's comic masterpiece, The Rogue of Seville, inspired imitations in many languages. Spain's golden age also produced the first great novelist, Miguel de Cervantes. In Don Quixote, Cervantes tells the story of an aging, foolish knight who has spent his dwindling fortune buying books. Feudal chivalry had become material for comedy. As Spain was defending Catholic Europe and conquering the Americas, England was becoming the strongest Protestant nation. At first, the English Reformation was more about dynasty than religion. After 30 years of marriage, King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon had only one child, a daughter, Mary. Henry wanted a son, but the Pope would not let him get a divorce. When Henry discovered that his mistress, Anne Boleyn, was carrying his child, he defied the Pope, divorced Catherine, and married Anne. This was a terrible insult to Catherine's nephew, Charles the Great, who pressured the Pope to excommunicate King Henry. The king responded by confiscating church lands, stripping the monasteries of their treasures, and demanding that church leaders acknowledge his supremacy over the church. Many English church leaders complied. Sir Thomas More refused and lost his head. Anne Boleyn was beheaded less than a year after Sir Thomas. Her child, Elizabeth, barely escaped the same fate. After a short Protestant reign by her half-brother Edward, and an even shorter Catholic reign by her half-sister Mary, Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558. She ruled for more than 40 years, presiding over England's Elizabethan Renaissance. Elizabeth the Great supported Protestant armies in Europe against her rivals in Bohemia, France, and Spain, and united England under the Protestant Anglican Church. Her loyal ship captains, John Hawkins, Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh pirated Spanish treasure galleons and explored the Americas. In 1588, Elizabeth's ships defeated the Spanish Armada, or armed navy, at a great battle in the English Channel. Her deeds were celebrated by great writers like Edmund Spenser, Philip Sidney, Walter Raleigh, Ben Jonson, and Christopher Marlowe. But the greatest Elizabethan humanist writer of all was William Shakespeare. Shakespeare celebrated English history, retold ancient love stories, composed classical poetry, and made the English language richer than ever before.
Shakespeare had some political impact because his plays were performed before the Queen. He could make some small political comment to the Queen, though they tended to be, his comments tended to be sort of hidden in the text. So in The Merchant of Venice, which is famous for its treatment of anti-Semitism, he makes a plea, in a sense, for religious tolerance.
The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth gently as a rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown.
Good Queen Bess died in 1601. Shakespeare lived until 1660, long enough to read the last literary masterpiece of the English Renaissance, the King James Bible. After Elizabeth's death, England's fragile religious peace was shattered. The Church and throne of England were threatened not only by Roman Catholic conspirators, but by Puritans, diggers, ranters, ravers, and other radical Protestant dissenters. During the 1600s, in search of liberty of conscience and armed with the King James Bible, the radicals would topple the English monarch, set up a religious commonwealth, and carry Protestant mercantilism to America and around the world. European nations were becoming world powers because of forces unleashed during the Renaissance and the Reformation.
There is a tide in the affairs of men, which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures.